Chapter 20. Ivor was gone. Lounging behind the windscreen in his yellow sedan, he was whirling across rural England. Social and amorous engagements of the most urgent character called him from hall to baronial hall, from castle to castle, from Elizabethan manor house to Georgian mansion, over the whole expanse of the kingdom. Today in Somerset, tomorrow in Warwickshire, and on Saturday in the West Riding. By Tuesday morning in Argyll. Ivor never rested. The whole summer through, from the beginning of July till the end of September, he devoted himself to his engagements. He was a martyr to them. In the autumn he went back to London for a holiday. Crome had been a little incident, an evanescent bubble on the stream of his life. It belonged already to the past. By tea-time he would be at Gobley, and there would be Zenobia's welcoming smile. And on Thursday morning, but that was a long, long way ahead. He would think of Thursday morning when Thursday morning arrived. Meanwhile there was Gobley, meanwhile Zenobia. In the visitor's book at Crome, Ivor had left, according to his invariable custom in these cases, a poem. He had improvised it magisterially in the 10 minutes preceding his departure. Denis and Mr. Scogan strolled back together from the gates of the courtyard, whence they had bidden their last farewells. On the writing-table in the hall they found a visitor's book open and Ivor's composition scarcely dry. Mr. Scogan read it aloud. The magic of those immemorial kings who webbed enchantment on the bowls of night sleeps in the soul of all created things, in the blue sea, the Acroceraunian height, in the eyed butterfly's auricular wings and orgied visions of the anchorite. In all that singing flies and flying sings, in rain, in pain, in delicate delight. But much more magic, much more cogent spells weave here their wizardries about my soul. Crome calls me like the voice of vesperal bells, haunts like a ghostly peopled necropole. Fate tears me hence, hard fate, since far from Crome my soul must weep, remembering its home. "Very nice and tasteful and tactful," said Mr. Scogan when he had finished. "I'm only troubled by the butterfly's auricular wings. You have a first-hand knowledge of the workings of a poet's mind, Denis. Perhaps you can explain." "What could be simpler?" said Denis. "It's a beautiful word, and Ivor wanted to say that the wings were golden." "You make it luminously clear." "One suffers so much," Denis went on, "from the fact that beautiful words don't always mean what they ought to mean. Recently, for example, I had a whole poem ruined just because the word carminative didn't mean what it ought to have meant. Carminative, it's admirable, isn't it?" "Admirable," Mr. Scogan agreed. "And what does it mean?" "It's a word I've treasured from my earliest infancy," said Denis. "Treasured and loved. They used to give me cinnamon when I had a cold, quite useless but not disagreeable. One poured it drop by drop out of narrow bottles, a golden liquor, fierce and fiery. On the label was a list of its virtues, and among other things it was described as being, in the highest degree, carminative. I adored the word. 'Isn't it carminative?' I used to say to myself when I'd taken my dose. It seemed so wonderfully to describe that sensation of internal warmth, that glow, that, what shall I call it, physical self-satisfaction which followed the drinking of cinnamon. Later, when I discovered alcohol, carminative described for me that similar but nobler, more spiritual glow which wine evokes, not only in the body but in the soul as well. The carminative virtues of Burgundy, of rum, of old brandy, of Lacryma Christi, of Marsala, of Aleatico, of stout, of gin, of champagne, of claret, of the raw new wine of this year's Tuscan vintage, I compared them, I classified them. Marsala is rosily, downily carminative. Gin pricks and refreshes while it warms. I had a whole table of carmination values. And now," Denis spread out his hands, palms upwards, despairingly, "now I know what carminative really means." "Well, what does it mean?" asked Mr. Scogan a little impatiently. "Carminative," said Denis, lingering lovingly over the syllables. "Carminative. I imagined vaguely that it had something to do with Carmen Carminis, still more vaguely with Caro Carnis, and its derivations like carnival and carnation. Carminative, there was the idea of singing and the idea of flesh rose-coloured and warm, with a suggestion of the jollities of Mi-Carême and the masked holidays of Venice. Carminative, the warmth, the glow, the interior ripeness were all in the word. Instead of which... "Do come to the point, my dear Denis," protested Mr. Scogan. "Do come to the point." "Well, I wrote a poem the other day," said Denis. "I wrote a poem about the effects of love." "Others have done the same before you," said Mr. Scogan. "There is no need to be ashamed." "I was putting forward the notion," Denis went on, "that the effects of love were often similar to the effects of wine, that Eros could intoxicate as well as Bacchus. Love, for example, is essentially carminative. It gives one the sense of warmth, the glow, and passion, carminative as wine, was what I wrote. Not only was the line elegantly sonorous, it was also, I flattered myself, very aptly, compendiously expressive. Everything was in the word carminative, a detailed, exact foreground, an immense, indefinite hinterland of suggestion, and passion carminative as wine. I was not ill-pleased. And then suddenly it occurred to me that I had never actually looked up the word in a dictionary. Carminative had grown up with me from the days of the cinnamon bottle. It had always been taken for granted. Carminative, for me the word was as rich in content as some tremendous, elaborate work of art. It was a complete landscape with figures. And passion carminative as wine. It was the first time I had ever committed the word to writing, and all at once I felt I would like lexicographical authority for it. A small English-German dictionary was all I had at hand. I turned up C, K, K, calm. There it was, carminative, windtreibend. "Windtreibend," he repeated. Mr. Scogan laughed. Denis shook his head. "Ah," he said, "for me it was no laughing matter. For me it marked the end of a chapter, the death of something young and precious. There were the years of childhood and innocence, when I had believed that carminative meant, well, carminative. And now before me lies the rest of my life, a day, perhaps 10 years, half a century, when I shall know that carminative means windtreibend. Plus ne suis ce que j'ai été, et ne le saurai jamais être. It is a realisation that makes one rather melancholy." "Carminative," said Mr. Scogan thoughtfully. "Carminative," Denis repeated, and they were silent for a time. "Words," said Denis at last, "words. I wonder if you can realise how much I love them. You are too much preoccupied with mere things and ideas and people to understand the full beauty of words. Your mind is not a literary mind. The spectacle of Mr. Gladstone finding 34 rhymes to the name Margot seems to you rather pathetic than anything else. Mallarme's envelopes with their versified addresses leave you cold, unless they leave you pitiful. You can't see that. Apte à ne point te cabrer. Hué, poste et j'ajouterai dia, si tu ne fuis 11 rue Balzac, chez cet hérédia, is a little miracle." "You're right," said Mr. Scogan. "I can't." "You don't feel it to be magical?" "No." "That's the best test of the literary mind," said Denis. "The feeling of magic, the sense that words have power. The technical, verbal part of literature is simply a development of magic. Words are man's first and most grandiose invention. With language he created a whole new universe. What wonder if he loved words and attributed power to them? With fitted, harmonious words, the magicians summoned rabbits out of empty hats and spirits from the elements. Their descendants, the literary men, still go on with the process, morticing their verbal formulas together, and, before the power of the finished spell, trembling with delight and awe. Rabbits out of empty hats? No, their spells are more subtly powerful, for they evoke emotions out of empty minds. Formulated by their art, the most insipid statements become enormously significant. For example, I proffer the constatation, black ladders lack bladders. A self-evident truth, one on which it would not have been worth while to insist had I chosen to formulate it in such words as black fire escapes have no bladders, or les échelles noires manquent de vessie. But I put it as I do. Black ladders lack bladders. It becomes, for all its self-evidence, significant, unforgettable, moving. The creation by word power of something out of nothing. What is that but magic? And, I may add, what is that but literature? Half the world's greatest poetry is simply Les échelles noires manquent des vessies, translated into magic significance as black ladders lack bladders. And you can't appreciate words. I'm sorry for you. A mental carminative, said Mr. Scogan reflectively. That's what you need. End of chapter. Chapter 21. Perched on its 4 stone mushrooms, the little granary stood 2 or 3 feet above the grass of the green close. Beneath it there was a perpetual shade and a damp growth of long, luxuriant grasses. Here, in the shadow, in the green dampness, a family of white ducks had sought shelter from the afternoon sun. Some stood, preening themselves, some reposed with their long bellies pressed to the ground, as though the cool grass were water. Little social noises burst fitfully forth, and from time to time some pointed tail would execute a brilliant Lisztian tremolo. Suddenly their jovial response was shattered. A prodigious thump shook the wooden flooring above their heads. The whole granary trembled. Little fragments of dirt and crumbled wood rained down among them. With a loud, continuous quacking, the ducks rushed out from beneath this nameless menace, and did not stay their flight till they were safely in the farmyard. "Don't lose your temper," Anne was saying. "Listen, you've frightened the ducks. Poor dears, no wonder." She was sitting sideways in a low wooden chair. Her right elbow rested on the back of the chair, and she supported her cheek on her hand. Her long, slender body drooped into curves of a lazy grace. She was smiling, and she looked at Gombauld through half-closed eyes. "Damn you!" Gombauld repeated, and stamped his foot again. He glared at her round the half-finished portrait on the easel. "Poor ducks," Anne repeated. The sound of their quacking was faint in the distance. It was inaudible. "Can't you see you make me lose my time?" he asked. "I can't work with you dangling about distractingly like this." "You'd lose less time if you stopped talking and stamping your feet and did a little painting for a change. After all, what am I dangling about for, except to be painted?" Gombauld made a noise like a growl. "You're awful," he said, with conviction. "Why do you ask me to come and stay here? Why do you tell me you'd like me to paint your portrait?" "For the simple reason that I like you, at least when you're in a good temper, and that I think you're a good painter." "For the simple reason," Gombauld mimicked her voice, "that you want me to make love to you, and, when I do, to have the amusement of running away." Anne threw back her head and laughed. "So you think it amuses me to have to evade your advances? So like a man. If you only knew how gross and awful and boring men are when they try to make love, and you don't want them to make love. If you could only see yourselves through our eyes." Gombauld picked up his palette and brushes and attacked his canvas with the ardour of irritation. "I suppose you'll be saying next that you didn't start the game, that it was I who made the first advances, and that you were the innocent victim who sat still and never did anything that could invite or allure me on." "So like a man again," said Anne. "It's always the same old story about the woman tempting the man. The woman lures, fascinates, invites, and man, noble man, innocent man, falls a victim. My poor Gombauld, surely you're not going to sing that old song again. It's so unintelligent. And I always thought you were a man of sense." "Thanks," said Gombauld. "Be a little objective," Anne went on. "Can't you see that you're simply externalising your own emotions? That's what you men are always doing. It's so barbarously naive. You feel one of your loose desires for some woman, and, because you desire her strongly, you immediately accuse her of luring you on, of deliberately provoking and inviting the desire. You have the mentality of savages. You might just as well say that a plate of strawberries and cream deliberately lures you on to feel greedy. In 99 cases out of 100, women are as passive and innocent as the strawberries and cream." "Well, all I can say is that this must be the 100th case," said Gombauld without looking up. Anne shrugged her shoulders and gave vent to a sigh. "I'm at a loss to know whether you're more silly or more rude." After painting for a little time in silence, Gombauld began to speak again. "And then there's Denis," he said, renewing the conversation as though it had only just been broken off. "You're playing the same game with him. Why can't you leave that wretched young man in peace?" Anne flushed with a sudden and uncontrollable anger. "It's perfectly untrue about Denis," she said indignantly. "I never dreamt of playing what you beautifully call the same game with him." Recovering her calm, she added in her ordinary cooing voice and with her exacerbating smile, "You've become very protective towards poor Denis all of a sudden." "I have," Gombauld replied, with a gravity that was somehow a little too solemn. "I don't like to see a young man—" "Being whirled along the road to ruin," said Anne, continuing his sentence for him. "I admire your sentiments, and, believe me, I share them." She was curiously irritated at what Gombauld had said about Denis. It happened to be so completely untrue. Gombauld might have some slight ground for his reproaches. But Denis... no. She had never flirted with Denis. Poor boy, he was very sweet. She became somewhat pensive. Gombauld painted on with fury, the restlessness of an unsatisfied desire which, before, had distracted his mind, making work impossible, seemed now to have converted itself into a kind of feverish energy. When it was finished, he told himself the portrait would be diabolic. He was painting her in the pose she had naturally adopted at the first sitting, seated sideways, her elbow on the back of the chair, her head and shoulders turned at an angle from the rest of her body towards the front. She had fallen into an attitude of indolent abandonment. He had emphasised the lazy curves of her body. The lines sagged as they crossed the canvas. The grace of the painted figure seemed to be melting into a kind of soft decay. The hand that lay along the knee was as limp as a glove. He was at work on the face now. It had begun to emerge on the canvas, doll-like in its regularity and listlessness. It was Anne's face, but her face as it would be, utterly unillumined by the inward lights of thought and emotion. It was the lazy, expressionless mask which was sometimes her face. The portrait was terribly like, and at the same time it was the most malicious of lies. Yes, it would be diabolic when it was finished, Gombauld decided. He wondered what she would think of it. End of chapter. Chapter 22. For the sake of peace and quiet, Denis had returned earlier on this same afternoon to his bedroom. He wanted to work, but the hour was a drowsy one, and lunch, so recently eaten, weighed heavily on body and mind. The meridian demon was upon him. He was possessed by that bored and hopeless post-prandial melancholy which the coenobites of old knew and feared under the name of accidie. He felt, like Ernest Dowson, a little weary. He was in the mood to write something rather exquisite and gentle, and quietist in tone. Something a little droopy, and at the same time, how should he put it, a little infinite. He thought of Anne, of love hopeless and unattainable. Perhaps that was the ideal kind of love, the hopeless kind, the quiet, theoretical kind of love. In this sad mood of repletion he could well believe it. He began to write. An elegant quatrain had flowed from beneath his pen. A brooding love which is, at most, the stealth of moonbeams when they slide, evoking colour's bloodless ghost o'er some scarce-breathing breast or side. When his attention was attracted by a sound from outside. He looked down from his window. There they were, Anne and Gombauld, talking, laughing together. They crossed the courtyard in front and passed out of sight through the gate in the right-hand wall. That was the way to the green close and the granary. She was going to sit for him again. His pleasantly depressing melancholy was dissipated by a puff of violent emotion. Angrily he threw his quatrain into the waste-paper basket and ran downstairs. The stealth of moonbeams, indeed. In the hall he saw Mr. Scogan. The man seemed to be lying in wait. Denis tried to escape, but in vain. Mr. Scogan's eye glittered like the eye of the ancient mariner. "Not so fast," he said, stretching out a small saurian hand with pointed nails. "Not so fast. I was just going down to the flower garden to take the sun. We'll go together." Denis abandoned himself. Mr. Scogan put on his hat, and they went out arm in arm. On the shaven turf of the terrace, Henry Wimbush and Mary were playing a solemn game of bowls. They descended by the yew tree walk. It was here, thought Denis, here that Anne had fallen, here that he had kissed her, here, and he blushed with retrospective shame at the memory, here that he had tried to carry her and failed. Life was awful. "Sanity," said Mr. Scogan, suddenly breaking a long silence. "Sanity. That's what's wrong with me, and that's what will be wrong with you, my dear Denis, when you're old enough to be sane or insane. In a sane world, I should be a great man. As things are in this curious establishment, I am nothing at all. To all intents and purposes, I don't exist. I am just vox et praeterea nihil." Denis made no response. He was thinking of other things. "After all," he said to himself, "after all, Gombauld is better looking than I, more entertaining, more confident, and, besides, he's already somebody, and I'm still only potential." "Everything that gets done in this world is done by madmen," Mr. Scogan went on. Denis tried not to listen, but the tireless insistence of Mr. Scogan's discourse gradually compelled his attention. "Men such as I am, such as you may possibly become, have never achieved anything. We're too sane, we're merely reasonable. We lack the human touch, the compelling, enthusiastic mania. People are quite ready to listen to the philosophers for a little amusement, just as they would listen to a fiddler or a mountebank. But as to acting on the advice of the man of reason, never. Whenever the choice has had to be made between the man of reason and the madman, the world has unhesitatingly followed the madman. For the madman appeals to what is fundamental, to passion and the instincts. The philosophers to what is superficial and supererogatory, reason. They entered the garden. At the head of one of the alleys stood a green wooden bench, embayed in the midst of a fragrant continent of lavender bushes. It was here, though the place was shadeless and one breathed hot, dry perfume instead of air, it was here that Mr. Scogan elected to sit. He thrived on untempered sunlight. Consider, for example, the case of Luther and Erasmus. He took out his pipe and began to fill it as he talked. There was Erasmus, a man of reason if ever there was one. People listened to him at first. A new virtuoso, performing on that elegant and resourceful instrument, the intellect. They even admired and venerated him. But did he move them to behave as he wanted them to behave, reasonably, decently, or at least a little less porkishly than usual? He did not. And then Luther appears, violent, passionate, a madman insanely convinced about matters in which there can be no conviction. He shouted, and men rushed to follow him. Erasmus was no longer listened to, he was reviled for his reasonableness. Luther was serious, Luther was reality, like the Great War. Erasmus was only reason and decency. He lacked the power, being a sage, to move men to action. Europe followed Luther and embarked on a century and a half of war and bloody persecution. It's a melancholy story. Mr. Scogan lighted a match. In the intense light the flame was all but invisible. The smell of burning tobacco began to mingle with the sweetly acrid smell of the lavender. If you want to get man to act reasonably, you must set about persuading them in a maniacal manner. The very sane precepts of the founders of religions are only made infectious by means of enthusiasms which to a sane man must appear deplorable. It is humiliating to find how impotent unadulterated sanity is. Sanity, for example, informs us that the only way in which we can preserve civilization is by behaving decently and intelligently. Sanity appeals and argues. Our rulers persevere in their customary porkishness while we acquiesce and obey. The only hope is a maniacal crusade. I am ready, when it comes, to beat a tambourine with the loudest, but at the same time I shall feel a little ashamed of myself. However, Mr. Scogan shrugged his shoulders and, pipe in hand, made a gesture of resignation. It's futile to complain that things are as they are. The fact remains that sanity unassisted is useless. What we want, then, is a sane and reasonable exploitation of the forces of insanity. We sane men will have the power yet. Mr. Scogan's eyes shone with a more than ordinary brightness, and, taking his pipe out of his mouth, he gave vent to his loud, dry, and somehow rather fiendish laugh. "But I don't want power," said Denis. He was sitting in limp discomfort at one end of the bench, shading his eyes from the intolerable light. Mr. Scogan, bolt upright at the other end, laughed again. "Everybody wants power," he said, "power in some form or other. The sort of power you hanker for is literary power. Some people want power to persecute other human beings. You expend your lust for power in persecuting words, twisting them, moulding them, torturing them to obey you. But I divagate." "Do you?" asked Denis faintly. "Yes," Mr. Scogan continued, unheeding. "The time will come, we men of intelligence will learn to harness the insanities to the service of reason. We can't leave the world any longer to the direction of chance. We can't allow dangerous maniacs like Luther, mad about dogma, like Napoleon, mad about himself, to go on casually appearing and turning everything upside down. In the past it didn't so much matter, but our modern machine is too delicate. A few more knocks like the Great War, another Luther or two, and the whole concern will go to pieces. In future, the men of reason must see that the madness of the world's maniacs is canalised into proper channels, is made to do useful work like a mountain torrent driving a dynamo. "Making electricity to light a Swiss hotel," said Denis. "You ought to complete the simile." Mr. Scogan waved away the interruption. "There's only one thing to be done," he said. "The men of intelligence must combine, must conspire, and seize power from the imbeciles and maniacs who now direct us. They must found the rational state." The heat that was slowly paralysing all Denis's mental and bodily faculties seemed to bring to Mr. Scogan additional vitality. He talked with an ever-increasing energy, his hands moved in sharp, quick, precise gestures, his eyes shone. Hard, dry and continuous, his voice went on sounding and sounding in Denis's ears with the insistence of mechanical noise. "In the rational state," he heard Mr. Scogan saying, "human beings will be separated out into distinct species, not according to the colour of their eyes or the shape of their skulls, but according to the qualities of their mind and temperament. Examining psychologists, trained to what would now seem an almost superhuman clairvoyance, will test each child that is born and assign it to its proper species. Duly labelled and docketed, the child will be given the education suitable to members of its species, and it will be set in adult life to perform those functions which human beings of his variety are capable of performing." "How many species will there be?" asked Denis. "A great many, no doubt," Mr. Scogan answered. "The classification will be subtle and elaborate, but it is not in the power of a prophet to go into details, nor is it his business. I will do more than indicate the three main species into which the subjects of the rational state will be divided." He paused, cleared his throat, and coughed once or twice, evoking in Denis's mind the vision of a table with a glass and water bottle, and, lying across one corner, a long white pointer for the lantern pictures. "Three main species," Mr. Scogan went on, "will be these: the directing intelligence, the men of faith, and the herd. Among the intelligences will be found all those capable of thought, those who know how to attain a certain degree of freedom, and, alas, how limited even among the most intelligent that freedom is, from the mental bondage of their time. A select body of intelligences, drawn from among those who've turned their attention to the problem of practical life, will be the governors of the rational state. They will employ as their instruments of power the second great species of humanity, the men of faith, the madmen, as I've been calling them, who believe in things unreasonably, with passion, and are ready to die for their beliefs and their desires. These wild men, with their fearful potentialities for good or for mischief, will no longer be allowed to react casually to a casual environment. There will be no more Caesar Borgias, no more Luthers and Mohammeds, no more Joanna Southcotts, no more Comstocks. The old-fashioned man of faith and desire, that haphazard creature of brute circumstance, who might drive men to tears and repentance, or who might equally well set them on to cutting one another's throats, will be replaced by a new sort of madman, still externally the same, still bubbling with a seemingly spontaneous enthusiasm, but, how very different from the madman of the past. For the new man of faith will be expending his passion, his desire, and his enthusiasm in the propagation of some reasonable idea. He will be, all unawares, the tool of some superior intelligence. Mr. Scogan chuckled maliciously. It was as though he were taking a revenge, in the name of reason, on enthusiasts. From their earliest years, as soon, that is, as the examining psychologists have assigned them their place in the classified scheme, the men of faith will have had their special education under the eye of the intelligences. Moulded by a long process of suggestion, they will go out into the world, preaching and practising with a generous mania the coldly reasonable projects of the directors from above. When these projects are accomplished, or when the ideas that were useful a decade ago have ceased to be useful, the intelligences will inspire a new generation of madmen with a new eternal truth. The principal function of the men of faith will be to move and direct the multitude. that third great species consisting of those countless millions who lack intelligence and are without valuable enthusiasm. When any particular effort is required of the herd, when it is thought necessary for the sake of solidarity that humanity shall be kindled and united by some single enthusiastic desire or idea, the men of faith, primed with some simple and satisfying creed, will be sent out on a mission of evangelization. At ordinary times, when the high spiritual temperature of a crusade would be unhealthy, the men of faith will be quietly and earnestly busy with the great work of education. In the upbringing of the herd, humanity's almost boundless suggestibility will be scientifically exploited. Systematically, from earliest infancy, its members will be assured that there is no happiness to be found except in work and obedience. They will be made to believe that they are happy, that they are tremendously important beings, and that everything they do is noble and significant. For the lower species, the earth will be restored to the centre of the universe, and man to preeminence on the earth. Oh, I envy the lot of the commonalty in the regional state, working there 8 hours a day, obeying their betters, convinced of their own grandeur and significance and immortality. They will be marvellously happy, happier than any race of men has ever been. They will go through life in a rosy state of intoxication, from which they will never awake. The men of faith will play the cup-bearers at this lifelong bacchanal, filling and ever filling again with the warm liquor that the intelligences in sad and sober privacy behind the scenes will brew for the intoxication of their subjects. "And what will be my place in the rational state?" Denis drowsily inquired from under his shading hand. Mr. Scogan looked at him for a moment in silence. "It's difficult to see where you would fit in," he said at last. "You couldn't do manual work. You're too independent and unsuggestible to belong to the larger herd. You have none of the characteristics required in a man of faith. As for the directing intelligences, they will have to be marvellously clear and mercilessly penetrating." He paused and shook his head. "No, I can see no place for you, only the lethal chamber." Deeply hurt, Denis emitted the imitation of a loud Homeric laugh. "I'm getting sunstroke here," he said, and got up. Mr. Scogan followed his example, and they walked slowly away down the narrow path, brushing the blue lavender flowers in their passage. Denis pulled a sprig of lavender and sniffed at it, then some dark leaves of rosemary that smelt like incense in a cavernous church. They passed a bed of opium poppies, dispetalled now. The round, ripe seed heads were brown and dry, like Polynesian trophies, Denis thought, severed heads stuck on poles. He liked the fancy enough to impart it to Mr. Scogan. Like Polynesian trophies, uttered aloud, the fancy seemed less charming and significant than it did when it first occurred to him. There was a silence, and in a growing wave of sound the whir of the reaping machines swelled up from the fields beyond the garden and then receded into a remoter hum. "It is satisfactory to think," said Mr. Scogan, as they strolled slowly onward, "that a multitude of people are toiling in the harvest fields in order that we may talk of Polynesia. Like every other good thing in this world, leisure and culture have to be paid for. Fortunately, however, it is not the leisured and the cultured who have to pay. Let us be duly thankful for that, my dear Denis, duly thankful," he repeated, and knocked the ashes out of his pipe. Denis was not listening. He had suddenly remembered Anne. She was with Gombold, alone with him in his studio. It was an intolerable thought. "Shall we go and pay a call on Gombold?" he suggested carelessly. "It would be amusing to see what he's doing now." He laughed inwardly to think how furious Gombold would be when he saw them arriving. End of chapter. Chapter 23. Gombold was by no means so furious at their apparition as Denis had hoped and expected he would be. Indeed, he was rather pleased than annoyed when the two faces, one brown and pointed, the other round and pale, appeared in the frame of the open door. The energy born of his restless irritation was dying within him, returning to its emotional elements. A moment more, and he would have been losing his temper again, and Anne would be keeping hers infuriatingly. Yes, he was positively glad to see them. Come in," he called out hospitably. Followed by Mr. Scogan, Denis climbed the little ladder and stepped over the threshold. He looked suspiciously from Gombauld to his sitter, and could learn nothing from the expression of their faces, except that they both seemed pleased to see the visitors. Were they really glad, or were they cunningly simulating gladness, he wondered. Mr. Scogan, meanwhile, was looking at the portrait. "Excellent," he said approvingly, "excellent. Almost too true to character, if that is possible. Yes, positively too true. But I'm surprised to find you putting in all this psychology business." He pointed to the face, and with his extended finger followed the slack curves of the painted figure. "I thought you were one of the fellows who went in exclusively for balanced masses and impinging planes." Gombauld laughed. "This is a little infidelity," he said. "I'm sorry," said Mr. Scogan. "I, for one, without ever having had the slightest appreciation of painting, have always taken particular pleasure in cubismus. I like to see pictures from which nature has been completely banished, pictures which are exclusively the product of the human mind. They give me the same pleasure as I derive from a good piece of reasoning or a mathematical problem or an achievement of engineering. Nature, or anything that reminds me of nature, disturbs me. It is too large, too complicated, above all too utterly pointless and incomprehensible. I am at home with the works of man. If I choose to set my mind to it, I can understand anything that any man has made or thought. That is why I always travel by tube, never by bus if I can possibly help it. For, travelling by bus, one can't avoid seeing, even in London, a few stray works of God, the sky, for example, an occasional tree, the flowers in the window-boxes. But travel by tube, and you see nothing but the works of man, iron riveted into geometrical forms, straight lines of concrete, patterned expanses of tiles. All is human and the product of friendly and comprehensible minds. All philosophies and all religions, what are they but spiritual tubes bored through the universe? Through these narrow tunnels, where all is recognisably human, one travels comfortable and secure, contriving to forget that all around and below and above them stretches the blind mass of the earth, endless and unexplored. Yes, give me the tube and cubismus every time. Give me ideas so snug and neat and simple and well made. And preserve me from nature, preserve me from all that's inhumanly large and complicated and obscure. I haven't the courage, and, above all, I haven't the time to start wandering in that labyrinth." While Mr. Scogan was discoursing, Denis had crossed over to the farther side of the little square chamber, where Anne was sitting, still in her graceful, lazy pose on the low chair. "Well?" he demanded, looking at her almost fiercely. What was he asking of her? He hardly knew himself. Anne looked up at him, and for an answer echoed his "well" in another, a laughing key. Denis had nothing more at the moment to say. 2 or 3 canvases stood in the corner behind Anne's chair, their faces turned to the wall. He pulled them out and began to look at the paintings. "May I see too?" Anne requested. He stood them in a row against the wall. Anne had to turn round in her chair to look at them. There was the big canvas of the man fallen from the horse, there was a painting of flowers, there was a small landscape. His hands on the back of the chair, Denis leaned over her. From behind the easel at the other side of the room, Mr. Scogan was talking away. For a long time they looked at the pictures, saying nothing, or, rather, Anne looked at the pictures while Denis, for the most part, looked at Anne. "I like the man and the horse, don't you?" she said at last, looking up with an inquiring smile. Denis nodded, and then, in a queer, strangled voice, as though it had cost him a great effort to utter the words, he said, "I love you." It was a remark which Anne had heard a good many times before, mostly heard with equanimity. But on this occasion, perhaps because they had come so unexpectedly, perhaps for some other reason, the words provoked in her a certain surprised commotion. "My poor Denis," she managed to say, with a laugh. But she was blushing as she spoke. End of chapter. Chapter 24. It was noon. Denis, descending from his chamber, where he had been making an unsuccessful effort to write something about nothing in particular, found the drawing-room deserted. He was about to go out into the garden when his eye fell on a familiar but mysterious object, the large red notebook in which he had so often seen Jenny quietly and busily scribbling. She had left it lying on the window-seat. The temptation was great. He picked up the book and slipped off the elastic band that kept it discreetly closed. "Private, not to be opened," was written in capital letters on the cover. He raised his eyebrows. It was the sort of thing one wrote in one's Latin grammar while one was still at one's preparatory school. "Black is the raven, black is the rook, but blacker the thief who steals this book." It was curiously childish, he thought, and he smiled to himself. He opened the book. What he saw made him wince as though he had been struck. Denis was his own severest critic, so at least he had always believed. He liked to think of himself as a merciless vivisector, probing into the palpitating entrails of his own soul. He was brown dog to himself. His weakness, his absurdities, no one knew them better than he did. Indeed, in a vague way, he imagined that nobody beside himself was aware of them at all. It seemed somehow inconceivable that he should appear to other people as they appeared to him. Inconceivable that they ever spoke of him among themselves in the same freely critical and, to be quite honest, mildly malicious tone in which he was accustomed to talk of them. In his own eyes he had defects, but to see them was a privilege reserved for him alone. For the rest of the world he was surely an image of flawless crystal. It was almost axiomatic. On opening the red notebook, that crystal image of himself crashed to the ground, and was irreparably shattered. He was not his own severest critic after all. The discovery was a painful one. The fruit of Jenny's unobtrusive scribbling lay before him, a caricature of himself reading. The book was upside down. In the background a dancing couple recognisable as Gombold and Anne. Beneath, the legend, "Fable of the Wallflower and the Sour Grapes." Fascinated and horrified, Denis pored over the drawing. It was masterful. A mute, inglorious Rouvert appeared in every one of those cruelly clear lines. The expression of the face, an assumed aloofness and superiority tempered by a feeble envy. The attitude of body and limbs, an attitude of studious and scholarly dignity, given away by the fidgety pose of the turned-in feet. These things were terrible. And more terrible still was the likeness, was the magisterial certainty with which his physical peculiarities were all recorded and subtly exaggerated. Denis looked deeper into the book. There were caricatures of other people, of Priscilla and Mr. Barbecue Smith, of Henry Wimbush, of Anne and Gombold, of Mr. Scogan, whom Jenny had represented in a light that was more than slightly sinister, that was indeed diabolic, of Mary and Ivor. He scarcely glanced at them. A fearful desire to know the worst about himself possessed him. He turned over the leaves, lingering at nothing that was not his own image. 7 full pages were devoted to him. Private, not to be opened. He had disobeyed the injunction. He had only got what he deserved. Thoughtfully he closed the book and slid the rubber band once more into its place. Sadder and wiser, he went out onto the terrace. And so this, he reflected, this was how Jenny employed the leisure hours in her ivory tower apart. And he had thought her a simple-minded, uncritical creature. It was he, it seemed, who was the fool. He felt no resentment towards Jenny. No, the distressing thing wasn't Jenny herself. It was what she and the phenomenon of her red book represented, what they stood for and concretely symbolised. They represented all the vast conscious world of men outside himself. They symbolised something that in his studious solitariness he was apt not to believe in. He could stand at Piccadilly Circus, he could watch the crowds shuffle past, and still imagine himself the one fully conscious, intelligent individual being among all those thousands. It seemed somehow impossible that other people should be in their way as elaborate and complete as he in his. Impossible, and yet periodically he would make some painful discovery about the external world and the horrible reality of its consciousness and its intelligence. The red notebook was one of these discoveries, a footprint in the sand. It put beyond a doubt the fact that the outer world really existed. Sitting on the balustrade of the terrace, he ruminated this unpleasant truth for some time. Still chewing on it, he strolled pensively down towards the swimming pool. A peacock and his hen trailed their shabby finery across the turf of the lower lawn. Odious birds, their necks thick and greedily fleshy at the roots, tapered up to the cruel inanity of their brainless heads, their flat eyes and piercing beaks. The fabulists were right, he reflected, when they took beasts to illustrate their tractates of human morality. Animals resemble men with all the truthfulness of a caricature. Oh, the red notebook! He threw a piece of stick at the slowly pacing birds. They rushed towards it, thinking it was something to eat. He walked on. The profound shade of a giant ilex tree engulfed him. Like a great wooden octopus, it spread its long arms abroad. Under the spreading ilex tree, he tried to remember who the poem was by, but couldn't. The smith a brawny man is he, with arms like rubber bands. Just like his, he would have to try and do his Muller exercises more regularly. He emerged once more into the sunshine. The pool lay before him, reflecting in its bronze mirror the blue and various greens of the summer day. Looking at it, he thought of Anne's bare arms and seal-sleek bathing dress, her moving knees and feet. A little loose with the white legs and bounding Barbary. Oh, these rags and tags of other people's making! Would he ever be able to call his brain his own? Was there indeed anything in it that was truly his own, or was it simply an education? He walked slowly round the water's edge. In an embayed recess among the surrounding yew trees, leaning her back against the pedestal of a pleasantly comic version of the Medici Venus, executed by some nameless mason of the Seicento, he saw Mary pensively sitting. "Hello," he said, for he was passing so close to her that he had to say something. Mary looked up. "Hello," she answered in a melancholy, uninterested tone. In this alcove, hewed out of the dark trees, the atmosphere seemed to Denis agreeably elegiac. He sat down beside her under the shadow of the pudic goddess. There was a prolonged silence. At breakfast that morning, Mary had found on her plate a picture postcard of Gobley Great Park, a stately Georgian pile with a façade 16 windows wide, parterres in the foreground, huge smooth lawns receding out of the picture to right and left. 10 years more of the hard times, and Gobley, with all its piers, will be deserted and decaying. 50 years, and the countryside will know the old landmarks no more. They will have vanished as the monasteries vanished before them. At the moment, however, Mary's mind was not moved by these considerations. On the back of the postcard, next to the address, was written in Ivor's bold, large hand a single quatrain: "Hail, maid of moonlight, bride of the sun, farewell. Like plumes moulted in an angel's flight, there sleep within my heart's most mystic cell memories of morning, memories of the night." There followed a postscript of 3 lines. "Would you mind asking one of the housemaids to forward the packet of safety razor blades I left in the drawer of my washstand? Thanks. Ivor." Seated under the Venus' immemorial gesture, Mary considered life and love. The abolition of her repression, so far from bringing the expected peace of mind, had brought nothing but disquiet, a new and hitherto unexperienced misery. Ivor, she couldn't do without him now. It was evident, on the other hand, from the poem on the back of the picture postcard, that Ivor could very well do without her. He was at Gobley now, so was Zenobia. Mary knew Zenobia. She thought of the last verse of the song he had sung that night in the garden. Le lendemain, Félix Pessard aurait ton mouton et chien pour un baiser que le volage à Lisette donnait pour rien. Mary shed tears at the memory. She had never been so unhappy in all her life before. It was Denis who first broke the silence. "The individual," he began in a soft and sadly philosophical tone, "is not a self-supporting universe. There are times when he comes into contact with other individuals, when he is forced to take cognizance of the existence of other universes besides himself." He had contrived this highly abstract generalization as a preliminary to a personal confidence. It was the first gambit in a conversation that was to lead up to Jenny's caricatures. "True," said Mary, and, generalising for herself, she added, "when one individual comes into intimate contact with another, she, or he, of course, as the case may be, must almost inevitably receive or inflict suffering." "One is apt," Denis went on, "to be so spellbound by the spectacle of one's own personality that one forgets that the spectacle presents itself to other people as well as to oneself." Mary was not listening. "The difficulty," she said, "makes itself acutely felt in matters of sex. If one individual seeks intimate contact with another individual in the natural way, she is certain to receive or inflict suffering. If, on the other hand, she avoids contacts, she risks the equally grave sufferings that follow on unnatural repressions. As you see, it's a dilemma." "When I think of my own case," said Denis, making a more decided move in the desired direction, "I am amazed how ignorant I am of other people's mentality in general, and above all, and in particular, of their opinions about myself. Our minds are sealed books only occasionally open to the outside world." He made a gesture that was faintly suggestive of the drawing off of a rubber band. "It's an awful problem," said Mary thoughtfully. "One has to have had personal experience to realise quite how awful it is." "Exactly," Denis nodded. "One has to have had first-hand experience." He leaned towards her and slightly lowered his voice. "This very morning, for example," he began. But his confidences were cut short. The deep voice of the gong, tempered by distance to a pleasant booming, floated down from the house. It was lunch-time. Mechanically Mary rose to her feet, and Denis, a little hurt that she should exhibit such a desperate anxiety for her food and so slight an interest in his spiritual experiences, followed her. They made their way up to the house without speaking. End of chapter. Chapter 25. "I hope you all realise," said Henry Wimbush during dinner, "that next Monday is Bank Holiday, and you'll all be expected to help in the fair." "Heavens!" cried Anne. "The fair! I'd forgotten all about it. What a nightmare! Couldn't you put a stop to it, Uncle Henry?" Mr. Wimbush sighed and shook his head. "Alas," he said, "I fear I cannot. I should have liked to put an end to it years ago, but the claims of charity are strong." "It's not charity we want," Anne murmured rebelliously. "It's justice." "Besides," Mr. Wimbush went on, "the fair has become an institution. Let me see, it must be 22 years since we started it. It was a modest affair then. Now..." He made a sweeping movement with his hand and was silent. It spoke highly for Mr. Wimbush's public spirit that he still continued to tolerate the fair. Beginning as a sort of glorified church bazaar, Crome's yearly charity fair had grown into a noisy thing of merry-go-rounds, coconut shies, and miscellaneous sideshows, a real genuine fair on the grand scale. It was the local St. Bartholomew, and the people of all the neighbouring villages, with even a contingent from the county town, flocked into the park for their Bank Holiday amusement. The local hospital profited handsomely, and it was this fact alone which prevented Mr. Wimbush, to whom the fair was a cause of recurrent and never diminishing agony, from putting a stop to the nuisance which yearly desecrated his park and garden. "I've made all the arrangements already," Henry Wimbush went on. "Some of the larger marquees will be put up tomorrow. The swings and the merry-go-round arrive on Sunday." "So there's no escape," said Anne, turning to the rest of the party. "You'll all have to do something. As a special favour, you're allowed to choose your slavery. My job is the tea-tent, as usual. Aunt Priscilla..." "My dear," said Mrs. Wimbush, interrupting her, "I have more important things to think about than the fair. But you need have no doubt that I shall do my best when Monday comes to encourage the villagers." "That's splendid," said Anne. "Aunt Priscilla will encourage the villagers. What will you do, Mary?" "I won't do anything where I have to stand by and watch other people eat." "Then you'll look after the children's sports." "All right," Mary agreed. "I'll look after the children's sports." "And Mr. Scogan?" Mr. Scogan reflected. "May I be allowed to tell fortunes?" he asked at last. "I think I should be good at telling fortunes." "But you can't tell fortunes in that costume." "Can't I?" Mr. Scogan surveyed himself. "You'll have to be dressed up. Do you still persist?" "I'm ready to suffer all indignities." "Good," said Anne, and turned to Gombold. "You must be our lightning artist," she said. "Your portrait for a shilling in 5 minutes." "It's a pity I'm not Ivor," said Gombold with a laugh. "I could throw in a picture of their auras for an extra sixpence." Mary flushed. "Nothing is to be gained," she said severely, "by speaking with levity of serious subjects. And, after all, whatever your personal views may be, psychical research is a perfectly serious subject." "And what about Denis?" Denis made a deprecating gesture. "I have no accomplishments," he said. "I'll just be one of those men who wear a thing in their buttonholes and go about telling people which is the way to tea and not to walk on the grass." "No, no," said Anne, "that won't do. You must do something more than that." "But what? All the good jobs are taken, and I can do nothing but lisp in numbers." "Well, then, you must lisp," concluded Anne. "You must write a poem for the occasion, an ode on Bank Holiday. We'll print it on Uncle Henry's press and sell it at 2p a copy." "Sixpence," Denis protested. "It'll be worth 6p." Anne shook her head. "2p," she repeated firmly. "Nobody will pay more than 2p." "And now there's Jenny," said Mr. Wimbush. "Jenny," he said, raising his voice, "what will you do?" Denis thought of suggesting that she might draw caricatures at 6p an execution, but decided it would be wiser to go on feigning ignorance of her talent. His mind reverted to the red notebook. Could it really be true that he looked like that? "What I will do," Jenny echoed. "What I will do." She frowned thoughtfully for a moment. Then her face brightened and she smiled. "When I was young," she said, "I learnt to play the drums." "The drums?" Jenny nodded, and in proof of her assertion agitated her knife and fork like a pair of drumsticks over her plate. "If there's any opportunity of playing the drums..." she began. "But of course," said Anne, "there's any amount of opportunity. We'll put you down definitely for the drums. That's the lot," she added. "And a very good lot too," said Gombold. "I look forward to my Bank Holiday. It ought to be gay." "It ought, indeed," Mr. Scogan assented, "but you may rest assured that it won't be. No holiday is ever anything but a disappointment." "Come, come," protested Gombold. "My holiday at Crome isn't being a disappointment." "Isn't it?" Anne turned an ingenuous mask towards him. "No, it isn't," he answered. "I'm delighted to hear it." "It's in the very nature of things," Mr. Scogan went on. "Our holidays can't help being disappointments. Reflect for a moment. What is a holiday? The ideal, the platonic holiday of holidays is surely a complete and absolute change. You agree with me in my definition?" Mr. Scogan glanced from face to face round the table. His sharp nose moved in a series of rapid jerks through all the points of the compass. There was no sign of dissent. He continued, "A complete and absolute change. Very well. But isn't a complete and absolute change precisely the thing we can never have? Never, in the very nature of things?" Mr. Scogan once more looked rapidly about him. "Of course it is. As ourselves, as specimens of Homo sapiens, as members of a society, how can we hope to have anything like an absolute change? We are tied down by the frightful limitation of our human faculties, by the notions which society imposes on us through our fatal suggestibility, by our own personalities. For us, a complete holiday is out of the question. Some of us struggle manfully to take one, but we never succeed. If I may be allowed to express myself metaphorically, we never succeed in getting farther than Southend." "You're depressing," said Anne. "I mean to be," Mr. Scogan replied, and expanding the fingers of his right hand, he went on. "Look at me, for example. What sort of a holiday can I take? In endowing me with passion and faculties, nature has been horribly niggardly. The full range of human potentialities is in any case distressingly limited. My range is a limitation within a limitation. Out of the 10 octaves that make up the human instrument, I can compass perhaps 2. Thus, while I may have a certain amount of intelligence, I have no aesthetic sense. While I possess the mathematical faculty, I am wholly without the religious emotions. While I am naturally addicted to venery, I have little ambition and am not at all avaricious. Education has further limited my scope. Having been brought up in society, I am impregnated with its laws. Not only should I be afraid of taking a holiday from them, I should also feel it painful to try to do so. In a word, I have a conscience as well as a fear of jail. Yes, I know it by experience. How often have I tried to take holidays, to get away from myself, my own boring nature, my insufferable mental surroundings?" Mr. Scogan sighed. But always without success, he added. Always without success. In my youth I was always striving, how hard, to feel religiously and aesthetically. Here, said I to myself, are two tremendously important and exciting emotions. Life would be richer, warmer, brighter, altogether more amusing if I could feel them. I try to feel them. I read the works of the mystics. They seem to me nothing but the most deplorable claptrap, as indeed they always must to anyone who does not feel the same emotion as the authors felt when they were writing. For it is the emotion that matters. The written work is simply an attempt to express emotion, which is in itself inexpressible, in terms of intellect and logic. The mystic objectifies a rich feeling in the pit of the stomach into a cosmology. For other mystics that cosmology is a symbol of the rich feeling. For the unreligious it is a symbol of nothing, and so appears merely grotesque. A melancholy fact, but I divagate. Mr. Scogan checked himself. So much for the religious emotion. As for the aesthetic, I was at even greater pains to cultivate that. I have looked at all the right works of art in every part of Europe. There was a time when, I venture to believe, I knew more about Taddeo di Poggibonsi, more about the cryptic Amico di Taddeo, even than Henry does. Today, I am happy to say, I have forgotten most of the knowledge I then so laboriously acquired. But without vanity I can assert that it was prodigious. I don't pretend, of course, to know anything about nigger sculpture or the later 17th century in Italy, but about all the periods that were fashionable before 1900 I am, or was, omniscient. Yes, I repeat it, omniscient. But did that fact make me any more appreciative of art in general? It did not. Confronted by a picture of which I could tell you all the known and presumed history, the date when it was painted, the character of the painter, the influences that had gone to make it what it was, I felt none of that strange excitement and exaltation which is, as I am informed by those who do feel it, the true aesthetic emotion. I felt nothing but a great weariness of spirit. Nevertheless, I must have gone on looking at pictures for 10 years before I would honestly admit to myself that they merely bored me. Since then I have given up all attempts to take a holiday. I go on cultivating my old stale daily self in the resigned spirit with which a bank clerk performs from 10 till 6 his daily task. A holiday? Indeed, I'm sorry for you, Gombold, if you still look forward to having a holiday. Gombold shrugged his shoulders. Perhaps, he said, my standards aren't as elevated as yours. But personally I found the war quite as thorough a holiday from all the ordinary decencies and sanities, all the common emotions and preoccupations, as I ever wanted to have. Yes, Mr. Scogan thoughtfully agreed. Yes, the war was certainly something of a holiday. It was a step beyond Southend. It was Weston-super-Mare. It was almost Ilfracombe. End of chapter.